France, July 1944. A narrow country road near Saint-Lô lies cracked under the summer heat. The air smells of burnt rubber and damp earth. Smoke drifts lazily over the hedgerows, the echo of artillery fading into the distance. Out of the haze, a group of American GIs advance, weary, helmets tilted low, rifles slung. Their eyes catch a strange silhouette by the roadside. A hulking machine, half truck, half tank. Its steel tracks glint with dust and oil. A black iron cross still clings to its side. Private Jenkins climbs up the side panel, brushing off soot to reveal a nameplate, Kraus Maffei, München. Inside, the cockpit feels like stepping into another world. Levers, gauges, and switches crowd the dashboard like a mechanical cathedral. The men stare in awe as the Maybach engine sputters, coughs, then roars to life. The ground trembles. The captured Sd.Kfz, Germany's prized heavy tractor, is theirs now. For a moment, they feel the thrill of conquering the enemy's engineering masterpiece. But soon they'll realize this beast drinks fuel like fire consumes air, and that discovery tells the story of two armies, two philosophies, and one war fought as much by machines as by men. To understand why a group of dusty American soldiers in Normandy found themselves driving a German Sd.Kfz, we have to step back to a time when the world was preparing for a new kind of war. The 1930s in Germany were a decade of motion, literal motion. Adolf Hitler's obsession with speed, mobility, and mechanization drove his military planners to design an army unlike any before. The Wehrmacht was not built to sit in trenches. It was built to move, fast, organized, and unstoppable. Central to that idea was one principle: mechanized logistics. It wasn't glamorous. Not a tank, not a fighter plane, but the silent backbone of Blitzkrieg was the vehicle that towed the guns, fueled the tanks, and carried the troops. Among them, one stood above all, the Sd.Kfz, or Sonderkraftfahrzeug 7, literally Special Motor Vehicle 7. It was conceived in the mid-1930s as part of Germany's half-track program. Each model was numbered according to its towing capacity, from the light Sd.Kfz 10 to the massive 12-ton Sd.Kfz 9, FAMO. The Sd.Kfz 7 sat in the middle, the 8-ton tractor. It was meant to haul one thing above all others: the 8.8 cm flak gun, the legendary 88, a weapon so feared it could rip through aircraft and Allied armor alike. To move such a beast, Germany needed a machine that could handle mud, snow, and shattered roads, something half-wheeled for steering, half-tracked for traction. The design that emerged was elegant and intimidating. Built primarily by Kraus Maffei, Büsing Nag, and Hansa Lloyd, it combined a 6-cylinder Maybach HL62 2K engine with a complex transmission that distributed power to both wheels and tracks. On open roads, it rolled like a truck. Off-road, it crawled like a tank. Its interior was luxury by wartime standards: padded seats for 12 men, a folding canvas roof, neatly arranged instrument panels. The Germans believed in engineering superiority, even in the smallest details. To them, this wasn't just a machine, it was a statement of identity. By the outbreak of war in 1939, thousands of Sd.Kfz 7s had rolled off assembly lines. They thundered across Poland, France, and the Soviet plains, hauling anti-aircraft guns, artillery, and wounded soldiers alike. German soldiers called it the faithful servant. Mechanics called it a headache. Why? Because perfection came at a price. Each vehicle required thousands of man-hours to build. Its intricate drive system needed constant lubrication and inspection. Spare parts were scarce, and the Maybach engine, though powerful, demanded high-octane fuel that Germany was already running short of. Still, to German engineers, it was worth it. The Sd.Kfz 7 embodied their faith in precision. To the men who drove it, it was reliability under fire, until, of course, it wasn't. As the war expanded, so did Germany's logistical nightmare. The same weapon that symbolized mechanized might began to show cracks in practicality. For every Sd.Kfz 7 that towed a flak gun, the Germans needed trucks to carry spare parts, mechanics to maintain it, and fuel convoys to feed its voracious engine. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the Americans were drawing a very different blueprint. In the United States, mass production was religion. Factories in Detroit and Ohio weren't chasing mechanical perfection. They were chasing numbers. The American philosophy was simple. A machine is only as good as its ability to keep moving, to be fixed in the field, to be replaced overnight. When the U.S. entered the war, they rolled out their own half-track, the M3. It wasn't sleek. It wasn't refined. It looked like a truck that had accidentally put on tank treads. But it worked. Where the Sd.Kfz took months to build, the M3 could be stamped out in days. Its engine was simple, its frame modular, its parts interchangeable with other vehicles. In the industrial duel between Germany and the Allies, this difference between precision and practicality would become decisive. And by the summer of 1944, when the Allies landed in Normandy and began pushing east, those philosophies would finally meet on the same muddy roads. One was the German Sd.Kfz, the beast. The other, the American M3, the workhorse. When U.S. soldiers first seized the Sd.Kfz, they expected superiority. What they found instead was complexity and a lesson in the cost of overengineering. By the time American forces entered France in mid-1944, they were running a logistical symphony on wheels. Supply convoys stretched from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines, a living organism of trucks, jeeps, fuel depots, and mechanics. To keep that system alive, every gallon of gasoline mattered. Each vehicle in the Allied arsenal, from the Sherman tank to the M3 half-track, had been designed with one thing in mind: efficiency under pressure. Not luxury, not precision, just momentum. So when the first captured Sd.Kfz arrived in Allied hands, curiosity ran high. To the GIs who saw them, they looked imposing, a mix of raw power and German craftsmanship. Here was a vehicle that towed the infamous 88mm gun, the very weapon that had shredded Allied tanks in North Africa, Sicily and Italy. Now the machine was theirs. At first, it felt like a small victory, the thrill of turning enemy steel into friendly use. Captured Sd.Kfz were inspected by mechanics and engineers. Some even pressed into service for towing captured artillery or hauling supplies. The vehicle's Maybach HL62 engine produced around 140 horsepower, impressive for its time. The transmission provided 10 forward gears, allowing for precise control even on the roughest terrain. The half-track suspension system distributed weight evenly, giving the vehicle stability in mud and snow where many Allied trucks bogged down. It was, in short, an engineering marvel. But that marvel came with a warning label, one the Americans would discover quickly, because the Sd.Kfz wasn't built for a world of mass production. It was built for a Germany that believed quality could outrun quantity. By contrast, the M3 half-track, the American equivalent, was practically a glorified truck with treads. It used the same white 160AX gasoline engine found in other vehicles, a simple carburetor system, and conventional steering. No exotic alloys, no over-engineered gearboxes, and yet the M3 was everywhere. Over 40,000 units rolled off assembly lines produced by companies like White, Diamond T, and Autocar. They carried infantry, pulled anti-aircraft guns, and served as ambulances. It wasn't a statement of design, it was a statement of logistics. The Sd.Kfz, on the other hand, cost almost 4 times as much to produce, guzzled fuel at an alarming rate, and required skilled mechanics to keep it running. Its complex track tensioning system demanded constant adjustment. Its engine consumed nearly 2 liters of gasoline per kilometer under load, far more than the American M3, which could stretch a gallon twice as far. For an army living off endless convoys of fuel trucks, that difference meant everything. When Allied engineers at the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps began technical studies on captured German vehicles in late 1944, their reports were filled with admiration and caution. They praised the craftsmanship, the materials, the precision machining, but they also noted maintenance impractical under field conditions, fuel consumption excessive, vehicle unsuitable for sustained Allied use. In simpler terms, it was beautiful but unsustainable. The German obsession with performance had become their downfall. In trying to perfect every machine, they had created a logistical monster, one that demanded constant feeding, constant care, and constant supply. The M3 half-track might not have been elegant, but it kept the Allied armies moving across Europe without complaint. Its parts could be swapped in the field with a wrench and a bit of swearing. The Sd.Kfz needed a workshop, a manual, and preferably a German engineer who didn't mind explaining 12 different lubrication points. By autumn 1944, the pattern was clear. American troops occasionally used the Sd.Kfz for short hauls, towing a gun, moving supplies, even joyriding between units, but few lasted long. They drank too much fuel, broke too often, and drew too much attention with their distinctive engine noise. Some were sent back to depots for study, others abandoned when spare parts ran out. The GIs joked that you'd need to capture a German fuel truck just to keep it running. And in that simple remark lay the irony of the entire war. The Germans built magnificent machines. The Americans built machines that won the war. The Sd.Kfz, once a symbol of Nazi might, had become a cautionary tale. A steel reminder that engineering brilliance means little if it can't survive the mud, the miles, and the math of logistics. The story of this captured half-track wasn't just about mechanics. It was about philosophy. And to understand that fully, we have to see the war through several angles: human, tactical, technological, and moral. Each perspective tells a piece of the truth, and together, they reveal why the Sd.Kfz remains both admired and infamous. The technological angle, beauty and complexity to a mechanic's eye, the Sd.Kfz was a masterpiece. Every lever, piston, and sprocket spoke of German precision. Its designers at Krauss-Maffei had not only built a tractor, they had built a mechanical orchestra. The half-track's Maybach HL62 2K engine, a 6-cylinder gasoline powerhouse, could move 8 tons of steel while towing another 8 behind it, typically an 80 mm Flak 18 or Flak 36. That meant pulling a 10-ton gun across swamps, frozen roads, or the endless mud of the Eastern Front. The engineering was clever: rubber-padded tracks to reduce vibration, torsion bar suspension for smoother rides, and an articulated steering system that blended truck agility with tank traction. In theory, it was the best of both worlds, but in practice it was a compromise that favored elegance over efficiency. Where the M3 half-track had one clutch and a straightforward transmission, the Sd.Kfz had layers of interlocked gears, requiring a trained driver who understood the rhythm of German machinery. Each Sd.Kfz required meticulous maintenance, lubricants, inspections, tension adjustments. Dust in Normandy or sand in North Africa could grind those precise gears into ruin within days. It was a paradox of war. The very precision that made it brilliant also made it brittle. Still, it was a marvel to behold. Its controls felt heavy but deliberate. The steelwork gleamed. Even its seats were cushioned, a small luxury in a world of mud and blood. When American mechanics examined one, they called it a car that thinks it's a tank. And they weren't wrong. The Sd.Kfz was mechanical ambition made real, a machine that could conquer nature, until nature fought back. The human angle, the GI and the German beast. When the GIs found their captured Sd.Kfz in France, it wasn't a trophy so much as a curiosity. It stood out like an exotic animal in a farmyard. They didn't know how to start it at first. German labels, German gauges, German engineering. It took trial, error, and a bit of luck to make the Maybach engine cough to life. The sound was different, deeper, smoother, more arrogant somehow. Driving it was another matter. Its clutch was stiff enough to break a knee. The gear ratios were so close that shifting required both patience and prayer. On paved roads it moved gracefully, but off-road, it felt like wrestling a bull, and yet there was a certain pride in it. To the men who drove it, the Sd.Kfz was a symbol, proof that the invincible German machine could be tamed. They'd laugh, calling it Kraut Cadillac or the Thirsty Mule. Then they'd glance at the fuel gauge and stop laughing. With an appetite that devoured nearly 100 liters every 60 miles, the Sd.Kfz quickly earned a reputation as a fuel hog. It could empty its tank before a Sherman tank could finish a patrol, so the romance faded quickly. Soon many crews parked their captured tractor beside an M3, loaded up the fuel-efficient American workhorse, and left the German machine to rust. But for a few miles, for those short bursts of thunder across the Norman countryside, they felt the thrill of driving something extraordinary. And maybe, just maybe, they understood the strange pride that German soldiers once felt. The tactical angle, strength that cost too much in theory, the Sd.Kfz was a general's dream. It could tow the mighty 80mm gun, carry a crew of 12, and even mount the weapon directly on its chassis for a mobile anti-aircraft role. It bridged the gap between artillery tractor and battlefield vehicle, part logistics, part weapon. During the Blitzkrieg years, that versatility was a decisive edge. In Poland and France, German guns followed their tanks across terrain where horses and trucks would have failed. When the Luftwaffe needed to reposition anti-aircraft batteries within minutes, the Sd.Kfz made it possible. But as the war dragged on, the dream turned into a drain. Each Sd.Kfz consumed vast amounts of fuel, about 1/3 more than a Panzer IV tank when hauling a heavy gun. Germany's fuel reserves were shrinking fast, and synthetic production could not keep up. By 1944, the Wehrmacht was rationing fuel so severely that many of these vehicles were immobilized, their crews forced to use horses or abandon the guns entirely. Even when operational, the Sd.Kfz maintenance burden was immense. Its half-track system wore out rapidly on hard roads. The rubber pads tore, the suspension arms bent, and the transmission overheated. For an army fighting on multiple fronts with dwindling resources, such complexity was poison. Meanwhile, the Allies rolled forward with simplicity. The M3 half-track wasn't built for glory. It was built to last. Where a German crew needed a specialist mechanic, an American driver could fix the M3 with a wrench and a swear word. Parts were universal, repairs were fast, and fuel, well, the Allies had oceans of it. In tactical terms, this difference was profound. Germany's machines were impressive, but their army couldn't afford to keep them impressive. The Sd.Kfz was a triumph of design and a tragedy of strategy. As the war pressed into late 1944, this difference between brilliance and practicality became visible on every battlefield road. Each burned-out Sd.Kfz beside an M3 convoy was a metaphor in steel, and behind that symbolism lay deeper contrasts still, in leadership, doctrine, and the moral choices that shaped two industrial empires. The leadership and doctrine angle, when philosophy shapes steel at its core. The Sd.Kfz was a reflection of Germany's leadership mindset, a machine born from the belief that war could be won by excellence. In the 1930s, when Heinz Guderian and other architects of Blitzkrieg envisioned a fast, mechanized army, they imagined vehicles that performed like instruments of precision. The Sd.Kfz fit perfectly into that dream, strong, exact, efficient, and, like the Wehrmacht itself, tightly disciplined. German military doctrine favored specialized tools for specific jobs. Every weapon had its purpose, every vehicle its precise role. It was engineering hierarchy turned into combat doctrine. But this specialization made the system fragile. If one cog failed, the entire machine suffered. The Allies, under leaders like Eisenhower and Patton, took the opposite approach. They built an army around adaptability. The M3 half-track wasn't designed to be perfect at any one thing. It was good enough at many. It could haul troops, mount a gun, carry ammo, or evacuate wounded. The Americans didn't need a specialized vehicle for every job. They just needed something that could be repaired, replaced, and redeployed faster than the enemy could react. This difference came straight from leadership philosophy. German generals trusted in quality as power. American generals trusted in quantity as momentum, and that divide echoed from the factories to the front lines. Where Germany saw machines as extensions of pride, the Allies saw them as tools, replaceable, expendable, and efficient. The Sd.Kfz was a general's dream on paper, but it became a logistician's nightmare in practice. Its very existence was proof that even brilliant doctrine can crumble when it collides with the brute math of war. The enemy's viewpoint, through the eyes of the Wehrmacht for the German soldiers, the Sd.Kfz was more than a machine. It was a companion, reliable, powerful, and, in its way, alive. Crews gave their vehicles names. They cared for them like comrades. Drivers learned every sound of the Maybach engine, every quirk in the steering, every vibration that warned of trouble. They'd boast that their half-tracks could pull a gun through swamps where Allied trucks would drown. And often, they were right. During the early campaigns, these machines gave the Wehrmacht a terrifying mobility advantage. The Sd.Kfz-7 could bring the deadly 88-meter flak gun to the front in minutes. When Allied tanks appeared, the 88 roared, and the Sd.Kfz-7 waited patiently to tow it elsewhere. German soldiers trusted it. They saw it as proof of their army's superiority, solid, precise, unstoppable. But as the war dragged on, that faith began to falter. By 1943, on the Eastern Front, drivers began to joke bitterly that their half-tracks drank like generals. Fuel shortages turned missions into rationed gambles. Many vehicles were abandoned, their tanks dry, their engines stripped for parts. Some crews resorted to horses to tow the guns once meant for motorized power. A cruel irony in a war built on mobility. And when they saw American M3s rumbling past, ugly, simple and multiplying by the thousands, a realization dawned. The enemy's machines might lack beauty, but they never stopped coming. For the German soldier, the Sd.Kfz-7 became a bittersweet memory, a symbol of what Germany once believed it could achieve, and what it could no longer sustain. The moral and industrial angle, precision versus pragmatism, every war is fought not only with weapons, but with philosophies of creation. The Sd.Kfz-7 and the M3 half-track embodied two worldviews, two moral and industrial ideologies colliding across Europe. In Nazi Germany, machines were expressions of power and perfection. Factories built each component to exacting standards, sometimes hand-fitting parts instead of using standardized molds. Workers were craftsmen, not assembly line operators. This produced extraordinary results and crippling inefficiency. By contrast, the American approach was democratic engineering. Henry Ford's legacy ran through every bolt. If something could be simplified, it was. If it could be mass-produced, it was standardized. No vehicle was sacred. What mattered was output. The M3 half-track wasn't pretty. But in the time it took to build one, said Kfz-7, the US could build half a dozen M3s and ship them across the Atlantic faster than German factories could repair their own machines. Morally, the difference ran deeper. The German obsession with perfection reflected a regime that equated superiority with virtue, believing that technological excellence proved national destiny. The Allies, by contrast, built their machines around the idea of utility for all. A vehicle that any soldier could drive, fix, or replace was inherently democratic. In a sense, the Sd.Kfz-7 was a moral reflection of the Third Reich itself, powerful, precise but unsustainable, consuming itself in pursuit of an impossible ideal. The M3 was the mirror opposite, humble, flawed, but enduring. And in war, endurance beats elegance. By the winter of 1944, these philosophies met in the mud and frost of Europe. One was burning itself out. The other was rolling endlessly forward. And as the GIs sat behind the wheel of that captured German tractor, hearing its thirsty engine devour fuel, they were unknowingly driving a metaphor, the German war machine itself. Because soon, that machine would seize, sputter, and stop. The morning mist hung low over the hedgerows of Normandy. Somewhere near Mortagne, a U.S. supply column had paused, not because of enemy fire, but because of curiosity. At the head of the column, parked beside a battered French farmhouse, stood the Sd.Kfz-7, a German prize-turned-Allied experiment. Its black iron cross had been hastily painted over with a crude white star. Corporal Davis, one of the motor pool mechanics, crouched beside its track, cigarette dangling from his mouth. "This thing's a beast," he muttered, tracing a hand along the massive sprocket wheel. "Can tow an 88 gun like it's nothing." The others gathered, intrigued. They'd captured it days earlier, abandoned by retreating German artillerymen, engine still warm, a testament to how quickly the Wehrmacht had been forced to flee. When Davis and his crew first examined it, they were stunned by its complexity. The dashboard looked more like an aircraft's cockpit than a truck's. Dozens of levers, dials, and labeled switches in neat Gothic script. Kraftstoff, Zündung, Druck. But soldiers are problem solvers. With a mix of intuition and stubbornness, they got it started. The Maybach engine came alive with a deep growl that seemed to echo the arrogance of its creators. The GIs cheered, half in triumph, half in disbelief. At first, it was glorious. The Sd.Kfz rolled over craters and hedges as though the earth itself bowed to it. When they hooked it to a disabled M4 Sherman, it pulled the tank free like a stubborn child's toy. Its power was undeniable. The front wheels gripped with surprising control. The tracks chewed through mud that would have swallowed a truck whole. The GIs admired it. They even joked that maybe they should start building these things back home. But within an hour, the glow began to fade. The fuel gauge dropped faster than their patience. The roar of the Maybach that had sounded so proud now seemed hungry, devouring their precious gasoline reserves. When they checked the tank, Davis swore under his breath. "We just filled it." The numbers didn't lie. Where the M3 half-track could go 150 miles on a tank, the Sd.Kfz-7 could barely make 60. They refueled, again and again. By the third refill, the novelty had worn off. The men joked bitterly that the machine was fighting the war one gas can at a time. Still, orders were orders. The vehicle was to be tested under operational conditions, towing a captured German 88mm gun to a nearby range for evaluation. They hitched the gun and began the slow, rumbling crawl toward the test site. The Sd.Kfz-7 handled beautifully, even under the weight of the Flak cannon. Onlookers couldn't help but admire it, the way it moved, the way it seemed carved from confidence itself. But admiration doesn't fill fuel tanks. 10 miles in, the engine began to sputter. Davis glanced at the gauge, empty again. They stopped by a hedgerow, surrounded by fields of sunflowers and smoke from distant shellfire. He climbed down, sweat streaking through the dust on his face. "You gotta be kidding me," he muttered. Private Jenkins leaned against the wheel, shaking his head. "She's a beauty, sure. But she's thirstier than a general on payday," they laughed. But there was frustration beneath the humor. Each gallon wasted on the German tractor was one less for the trucks. One less for the tanks still pushing toward Paris. By afternoon, command made the call. The Sd.Kfz-7 would be returned to base for analysis and likely scrapped for parts. That night, the machine sat silent beside the road. Its steel frame still warm, its tracks caked with mud. A fading symbol of a different philosophy of war. The Americans had learned their lesson in a single day. Power without practicality is a luxury you can't afford in combat. As the convoy resumed its march, the Sd.Kfz-7 was left behind, a stranded monument to German engineering, and to the irony that sometimes too much brilliance can be a flaw, yet for all its faults, that day had revealed something deeper, a truth that no soldier could ignore. The real war wasn't fought just with bullets or bravery, but with fuel, factories, and philosophy. And in that war, the Germans were already losing. The next morning, that same Sd.Kfz-7 was towed back to an Allied depot. There, under the bright lights of a canvas-covered workshop, engineers began to dismantle it piece by piece, studying every bolt, every bearing, every secret of its design. They wanted to understand not just how it worked, but why it failed, because hidden in its roaring engine was the story of an entire nation's downfall. The Sd.Kfz-7 sat beneath a floodlight in the Allied maintenance yard, its steel hull smeared with oil and its German insignia barely visible beneath the hasty white paint. Around it, American ordnance officers and engineers circled like surgeons preparing for an autopsy. Clipboards in hand, they took notes on every component. The Maybach HL62 engine was removed, placed on a wooden pallet, its innards gleaming like muscle under lamplight. The mechanics muttered in admiration. "Beautifully made," one said. "Overcomplicated as hell," another replied. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. On one side of the depot, rows of M3 half-tracks sat ready, simple, efficient, standardized. On the other, this captured German machine was a piece of art, beautiful, but hopelessly impractical. The engineers soon discovered just how impractical. Each track link was individually cast and bolted, not stamped. Each gear tooth was precision ground, not molded. Each component required specialized maintenance tools. In short, it was a machine designed to win battles, not wars. Reports from the field began pouring in. Other Allied units had encountered Kf-7s too, some captured intact, others disabled by their own crews. The story was always the same: amazing when running, impossible to sustain. Fuel consumption reports stunned even experienced logisticians. When hauling a gun or heavy load, the Sd.Kfz burned more than 120 liters per 100 kilometers, more than double that of the M3. Its range was a fraction of what Allied convoys required. For a Wehrmacht already starved of fuel by mid-1944, that was fatal. The Allies, in contrast, ran on a river of gasoline, an industrial miracle called the Red Ball Express. Thousands of trucks, manned largely by African-American drivers, thundered day and night to feed Patton's Third Army. The M3s rolled alongside them, sturdy and obedient, while the Sd.Kfz-7s they occasionally encountered were often stranded, symbols of a different kind of army, one that had run out of breath. The ordnance officers studying the captured half-track wrote up their conclusions. Engineering quality superior, combat utility limited, fuel consumption prohibitive, field maintenance impractical. Those words became part of a larger revelation spreading through Allied command, that the German war machine's brilliance had become its own undoing. German tanks, vehicles and aircraft were marvels of design, but they demanded perfect fuel, perfect parts, and perfect conditions. The Allies didn't need perfection. They needed endurance. The Sd.Kfz-7 represented a tragic overreach, the mechanical manifestation of a regime that believed itself unstoppable, even when its factories were burning and its supply lines collapsing. Meanwhile, in the field, word spread quickly among American troops. The captured half-tracks became a running joke in motor pools and mess tents. "Want to move a mile?" one sergeant quipped. "Bring a barrel of gas and a prayer." The Germans, once feared for their machines, were now seen as victims of their own arrogance. The Sd.Kfz-7 had become a symbol, not of strength but of overreach. Even the GIs who had driven it spoke with a strange mix of respect and pity. "It's like fighting a guy with a Rolex when all you need is a pocket watch," Davis reportedly told a reporter from Stars and Stripes. That line made its way through the ranks, an unofficial epitaph for the Staff's 7, and, in some ways, for the entire German war effort. As winter closed in, the last of the captured Sd.Kfz were either scrapped or shipped to testing grounds in England. There, under calm skies far from the chaos of the front, British and American analysts took their time dissecting the German war vehicles. They marveled at the machine's engineering, even as they recorded its fatal flaws. Every test confirmed what the men in Normandy already knew. The Sd.Kfz-7 wasn't built for the kind of war Germany found itself fighting. It was built for victory parades that never came. By early 1945, Allied factories were producing thousands of half-tracks and trucks every week. While Germany struggled to keep even a fraction of its vehicles fueled, the contrast was absolute. The Sd.Kfz-7, once the proud servant of the ATE Memata Flak, now sat forgotten in depots or destroyed on the roadside, monuments to a vanished idea of war. Its roar had faded. Its tracks rusted, but its lesson endured. The Americans had learned that efficiency wins campaigns. The Germans had learned, too late, that beauty doesn't conquer logistics. From that point on, the story of the Sd.Kfz-7 became more than just about a machine. It became a metaphor for the hubris of overengineering, the danger of pride, and the quiet genius of simplicity. Because in the end, the side that could sustain its machines would sustain its soldiers, its advance, and its victory. The machine that once symbolized German mastery was now just another artifact in Allied hands, silent, gleaming, and defeated. And as the Allies prepared for the final push toward the Rhine, that captured tractor, sitting quietly under canvas tarps, seemed to whisper its own confession. Power without practicality is just noise. When the guns finally quieted in Europe, the Sd.Kfz-7, like so many of Germany's once mighty machines, found itself relegated to scrapyards, testing grounds, and military museums. The war had ended not with a thunderous clash of steel, but with the steady hum of supply trucks, bulldozers, and diesel engines rebuilding what the fire had erased. For the Allies, the war had proven a fundamental truth. Logistics, not luxury, wins modern wars. As captured German vehicles rolled into Allied research depots in France, England and the United States, engineers poured over them like archaeologists unearthing a vanished civilization. Their goal wasn't admiration, it was understanding. The Sd.Kfz in particular became an object lesson in the limits of engineering genius. At Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, one of the first fully functional Sd.Kfz was disassembled bolt by bolt. The report that followed was both glowing and damning. It praised its exceptional craftsmanship and technical refinement, yet criticized its excessive maintenance complexity and unsustainable fuel consumption. The American engineers were impressed by the details, the precision of its track system, the smooth gear transition, the flawless machining of its components. They even noted the quality of the German steel alloy, which showed almost no deformation under stress. But those same qualities, they concluded, were what doomed it. Every beautifully machined part represented extra labor, extra time, extra cost, all luxuries that a wartime economy couldn't afford at scale. Meanwhile, the American M3 half-track and its successor, the M5, had proven the opposite approach correct. They weren't elegant, but they were efficient, dependable, and replaceable. Soldiers could strip one for parts to fix another. Civilians could be trained to build them in weeks. Germany built for precision. America built for persistence. And the side that could keep its engines running longest decided the fate of Europe. As occupation troops moved deeper into Germany, they found entire motor pools of abandoned half-tracks, Kfz 8s and 9s, sitting silent, many without fuel, others cannibalized for parts. German mechanics, once meticulous, had turned desperate in those final months, burning engine oil mixed with alcohol, even draining aviation fuel from downed aircraft just to keep a few vehicles alive. When Allied commanders saw this, they understood. The Wehrmacht hadn't been beaten in spirit. It had been strangled by logistics. The Sd.Kfz had become a symbol of that suffocation. In the months that followed, Allied militaries published comparative studies on Axis and Allied vehicles. One recurring conclusion stood out in nearly every report. The German preference for technical excellence often led to operational inefficiency. It was a polite way of saying that brilliance had blinded them. At the same time, the Allies took what they could learn from the Sd.Kfz. Its track design influenced some post-war development in Western Europe. The idea of half-track versatility, though ultimately replaced by fully tracked or wheeled vehicles, lingered in military doctrine for years. But perhaps the most enduring lesson wasn't mechanical at all. It was philosophical. The Sd.Kfz taught future generations of engineers that technology without sustainment is self-defeating. That war doesn't reward beauty. It rewards adaptability. By 1946, most surviving Sd.Kfz had either been scrapped or repurposed for civilian work. In Eastern Europe, a few were converted into forestry tractors. In Czechoslovakia and Poland, Soviet units briefly pressed them into recovery roles before abandoning them due to fuel issues. The once proud artillery tractor of the Wehrmacht ended its days hauling logs, not guns. And somewhere in that irony, a machine designed for domination reduced to pulling timber through the woods was the quiet conclusion of its story. Yet the lessons it carried weren't forgotten. For Allied engineers and historians alike, the Sd.Kfz became a reminder that every tank, every plane, every gun depends on one fragile constant: the ability to move, to refuel, to endure. Because in modern war, mobility is survival, and perfection, ironically, is a burden. By the late 1940s, the Sd.Kfz existed mostly as memory and metal fragments scattered across Europe. What had once been the mechanical pride of the Wehrmacht was now the subject of study, fascination and quiet disbelief among the victors. The Allies had encountered countless examples of German overengineering, from the Tiger tanks to the V-2 rockets, but few, Machines captured that contradiction more perfectly than the Sd.Kfz. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a tank. It was a tool. And yet, its design philosophy revealed everything about the mindset of the regime that built it. To American logisticians, it became the case study for what not to do. At the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, instructors used it to explain the dangers of narrow specialization. The vehicle was exceptional at one job, towing heavy artillery, but too inefficient for multi-purpose use. In a global war, such single-role machines became liabilities. British analysts took a different lesson, the importance of industrial scalability. For every Sd.Kfz Germany built, the Allies could build a dozen M3s or GMC trucks. The ability to mass produce was not just an advantage, it was a weapon. Meanwhile, across Germany, engineers and factory workers faced the aftermath of their own design philosophy. Factories that once built Sd.Kfz vehicles were now under Allied supervision. Some were dismantled, others were retooled for civilian production. Krauss-Maffei, the original builder of the Sd.Kfz would later pivot toward peacetime industry, eventually becoming known for locomotives and, decades later, the Leopard tank, a design that embraced the very lessons of the past. Simpler maintenance, better efficiency, modular construction. It's as if the ghosts of those half-tracks whispered reminders from history. Don't build what you can't sustain. For the men who had driven them, both German and American, the memory of the Sd.Kfz lingered in anecdotes more than in hardware. German veterans remembered it with affection. They called it zuverlässig, reliable, even as they cursed its fuel thirst. It had carried their guns through blizzards and mud, through retreats and ambushes. To them, it was a comrade, not just a vehicle. American troops remembered it differently. To them, it was exotic, impressive, but absurd. A machine that symbolized everything they admired and pitied about their enemy. Intelligent, disciplined, but trapped by its own perfectionism. One GI later recalled in a post-war interview, "That German tractor was like their whole army. Fancy, tough, but it needed too much to keep going. Ours were rough, ugly, but they just wouldn't quit." In that single quote lay the summation of the entire industrial war. By the 1950s, only a handful of Sd.Kfz remained intact. Museum pieces, curiosities in military exhibitions. At the Imperial War Museum in London, visitors could climb into one and marvel at the overbuilt levers and polished fittings. Guides would explain its history not as a triumph, but as a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, nations rebuilding their armies in the post-war years quietly aligned themselves with the American model of production. Vehicles built not for elegance, but for endurance. The Jeep, the GMC, the deuce-and-a-half truck, these became the global standard. Germany's war machines, for all their sophistication, were relics of a fading industrial age. The last gasp of an empire that had mistaken craftsmanship for strategy. But the story didn't end entirely in the past. In the decades that followed, historians and engineers would look back on the Sd.Kfz and its kin not with scorn, but with awe. It represented what human ingenuity can achieve when freed from constraints, and what happens when that ingenuity forgets practicality. Even today, restored Sd.Kfz appear in museums and private collections, their engines still capable of that deep, resonant growl. They stand as monuments to a truth that every soldier, engineer, and historian understands. Power means nothing without supply, and so the Sd.Kfz became more than a machine. It became a story, one about how wars are won not by brilliance alone, but by balance. The Allies didn't just defeat the German army. They defeated its philosophy, proving that in war, survival favors not the strongest, but the simplest. The steel has rusted, the engines are silent. But the lesson echoes on, in every army, every factory, every blueprint since, because behind every victory lies not just courage or genius, but the quiet hum of a machine that can keep moving when the others can't. In the end, the Sd.Kfz was never just a vehicle. It was an idea, the idea that perfection wins wars. It came from a nation that believed craftsmanship could overcome numbers, that precision could outlast persistence. And for a while it seemed true. The early blitzkrieg victories dazzled the world. German columns moved with mechanical grace, their engines roaring like an orchestra of steel. But as the years ground on, perfection turned to paralysis. Every beautifully machined bolt demanded a refinery, a toolmaker, a technician, all things Germany could no longer afford. Across the Channel, American factories were doing something less elegant, but infinitely smarter. They were building enough trucks, enough tanks, enough spare parts to drown the Reich in momentum. That was the real miracle of the Allied war effort. Not the technology, but the simplicity. The Sd.Kfz 7, with its proud Maybach heart and its elegant inefficiency, became the perfect symbol of that contrast. It could pull an 80mm gun through hell, but it couldn't pull Germany out of its own industrial overreach. Standing beside one today, restored, gleaming under museum lights, you can almost hear the echoes of both sides. The German engineer who once admired its flawless gears. The American mechanic who cursed its fuel thirst. Two men from opposite worlds, both bound by the same truth, that in war the greatest strength is not sophistication, but endurance. The Sd.Kfz 7 burned bright and fast, a monument to ambition without balance. The M3 half-track rolled steady and sure, a monument to practicality without pride. And between them lies the lesson that shaped the modern age of warfare. Machines don't win wars. Systems do. Every convoy, every fuel line, every crude yet reliable vehicle in the Allied arsenal was part of that system. The quiet, relentless engine of victory. So the next time you see an Sd.Kfz 7, a giant that once ruled the battlefield but was beaten by its own hunger, remember the men who drove it, the fuel it consumed, and the irony it carried. Because buried beneath its steel is a simple truth. Brilliance is impressive. But in war, sustainability wins.